Sarah Martinez had always been careful about keeping her sleeves rolled down. Even during the hottest summer days at the law firm, where she worked as a junior associate, she maintained her professional appearance with long-sleeved blouses and blazers. Her colleagues often joked about her dedication to formal wear, but Sarah just smiled and changed the subject. The morning of September 15th started like any other Tuesday. Sarah arrived at the office early, carrying her usual coffee and briefcase. She was preparing for what could be the most important case of her young career, representing Maria Santos, an elderly immigrant woman who was fighting deportation after living in the country for 40 years. The case had drawn unexpected attention from the media. Maria's story was compelling. She had arrived as a young woman, worked multiple jobs to support her family, and had become a beloved figure in her community. She ran a small grocery store that had become a gathering place for immigrants seeking help with paperwork, translation services, and advice about navigating life in America. Sarah had discovered several legal precedents that could help Maria's case, but she needed to present them before a particularly tough immigration judge known for his strict interpretations of the law. Judge Harrison had a reputation for showing little mercy, and Sarah knew she had only one chance to make her argument convincing. As Sarah reviewed her notes one final time, her supervisor, Mr. Patterson, knocked on her office door. His expression was unusually serious, and Sarah felt her stomach tighten with worry. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. "I've just received some disturbing information about your client, Maria Santos." Sarah looked up from her papers, confused. "What kind of information?" Mr. Patterson sat down across from her desk, his face grave. "Someone has come forward claiming that Maria Santos was involved with a resistance group during the Civil War in her home country. They're saying she has connections to people who committed violent acts against the government." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. This was exactly the kind of allegation that could destroy Maria's case completely. Immigration judges were required to deny asylum or legal status to anyone connected with terrorist activities or violent resistance movements. "Who is making these claims?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "A man named Carlos Vega. He says he knew Maria back in El Salvador and that she was part of a group that bombed government buildings. He's provided what appears to be documentary evidence." Sarah's mind raced. She had spent months getting to know Maria, listening to her stories about fleeing violence in her home country. Maria had always described herself as a victim of the Civil War, not a participant. But Sarah also knew that the situation in El Salvador during the 1980s had been incredibly complex, with ordinary citizens sometimes forced to choose sides or face death. "I need to speak with Maria immediately," Sarah said, reaching for her phone. "She's already here," Mr. Patterson said. "I've put her in conference room B. Sarah, I have to warn you. If these allegations are true, the firm might not be able to continue representing her. We can't risk our reputation on a case involving potential terrorist connections." Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. She gathered her files and walked down the hallway to the conference room, her heart pounding. When she opened the door, she found Maria sitting quietly at the large wooden table, her hands folded in her lap. At 72 years old, Maria had the weathered face of someone who had lived through unimaginable hardships, but her eyes still held a spark of determination. "Maria, we need to discuss some serious allegations that have been made against you," Sarah began, taking a seat across from her client. Maria's expression didn't change, but Sarah noticed her hands tighten slightly. "What kind of allegations?" Sarah explained what Mr. Patterson had told her about Carlos Vega's claims. As she spoke, she watched Maria's face carefully, looking for any sign of deception or recognition. Maria listened in silence, her dark eyes never leaving Sarah's face. When Sarah finished, Maria was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she spoke in her heavily accented English. "Carlos Vega is a name I have not heard in many years. He was someone from my past in El Salvador. Maria, I need you to be completely honest with me. Were you involved with any resistance groups during the Civil War?" Maria looked down at her hands, and Sarah could see her struggling with something. The silence stretched between them, filled with tension and unspoken history. Mija, Maria finally said, using the Spanish term of endearment she often used with Sarah. There are things about my past that I have never told anyone. Not my children, not my husband before he died, not even the priests in my church. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Maria, whatever you tell me is protected by attorney-client privilege. But I need to know the truth if I'm going to help you. Maria stood up slowly and walked to the window that overlooked the busy street below. For several minutes, she stood there watching the people hurrying past on the sidewalk, ordinary citizens going about their daily lives without fear of deportation or persecution. In El Salvador, during the war, there was no such thing as innocent people, Maria began, her voice barely above a whisper. The government soldiers would come to villages and kill anyone they suspected of helping the rebels. The rebels would come and kill anyone they thought was helping the government. People like me, we were caught in the middle. She turned back to face Sarah, and there were tears in her eyes. My brother was killed by government forces when I was 19 years old. They said he was carrying messages for the resistance, but he was just a teacher at the local school. After that, some people in my village asked me to help them. Sarah felt her heart sinking. What kind of help? They needed someone to carry supplies to people hiding in the mountains. Food, medicine, sometimes information about where the soldiers were planning to search next. I was young and small, and the soldiers didn't pay much attention to women carrying baskets to market. Were you formally part of any resistance organization? Maria shook her head. There was no formal anything. It was just people trying to survive, trying to protect their families and neighbors. But yes, I helped the resistance fighters. I brought them what they needed to stay alive. Sarah took notes carefully, knowing that this admission could complicate Maria's case significantly. Did you ever participate in any violent activities? Never, Maria said firmly. I never touched a weapon, never helped plan any attacks. I only carried supplies and sometimes messages. But I know that some of the people I helped went on to fight against the government forces. The room fell silent again as Sarah processed this information. She understood that Maria's actions had been motivated by survival and compassion rather than political ideology, but she also knew that immigration law didn't always make such distinctions. Maria, there's something else I need to ask you about. Mr. Vega claims to have documentary evidence of your involvement. Do you have any idea what that might be? Maria's face went pale, and she sat back down heavily in her chair. She stared at the table for a long time before answering. There's a list, she said finally. The resistance fighters kept records of people who helped them, partly for security reasons, and partly so they could protect those people if the war ended, and there were reprisals. My name would have been on that list. Sarah felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. A document with Maria's name on it, created by a resistance organization, would be extremely difficult to explain away in immigration court. Do you think Carlos Vega might have had access to such a list? Carlos was more involved than I was, Maria said carefully. He was one of the people who organized the supply routes. If anyone would have kept records, it would have been him. Sarah realized that they were facing a much more complicated situation than she had initially thought. Even if Maria's role had been relatively minor and motivated by compassion rather than politics, the existence of documentary evidence could make it nearly impossible to defend her case successfully. Maria, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Is there anything else about your past that might come out during this process? Anything else that Carlos Vega or someone else might know about? Maria looked at Sarah with an expression of deep sadness and resignation. Slowly, she began to roll up the sleeve of her left arm, revealing skin that Sarah had never seen before. There's one more thing, Maria said quietly. Something that I have hidden for 40 years. As the fabric of her sleeve moved higher, Sarah could see the edge of what appeared to be a tattoo on Maria's forearm. Her heart began to race as she realized that whatever Maria was about to show her could change everything about the case. Maria finished rolling up her sleeve and extended her arm across the table toward Sarah. There, clearly visible on her forearm, was a small but distinct tattoo of a bird in flight surrounded by a circle. Sarah stared at the tattoo, not understanding its significance, but knowing instinctively that it was important. What does it mean? It is the symbol of the group I worked with, Maria said, her voice heavy with the weight of decades of secrecy. Everyone who helped the resistance in our region received this mark. It was a way of identifying each other and showing commitment to the cause. Sarah felt the walls of the conference room closing in around her. A tattoo was physical evidence that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as hearsay. If Carlos Vega knew about the tattoo and its meaning, Maria's case would be virtually impossible to win. Who else knows about this tattoo? Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Very few people, Maria replied. Most of them are dead now. But Carlos would know. He was there when I received it. Sarah looked at the small symbol on Maria's arm and realized that this elderly woman who had spent 40 years building a life in America, helping other immigrants and contributing to her community, might be destroyed by a decision she had made as a desperate teenager during a civil war. The irony was devastating. The same courage and compassion that had led Maria to help her neighbors during wartime had continued to define her character throughout her life in America. But the law might not recognize the difference between a 19-year-old girl carrying medicine to wounded fighters and a committed political terrorist. As Maria rolled her sleeve back down, hiding the tattoo once again, Sarah knew that they were facing an uphill battle that would require every ounce of legal skill and creativity she possessed. The question was whether it would be enough to save a woman who had already survived so much and asked for so little in return. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the office before dawn, her mind racing with possible legal strategies. She had spent most of the night researching immigration law precedents involving individuals who had participated in resistance movements during civil wars. The results were not encouraging. As she sat in her dimly lit office, surrounded by law books and case files, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the tattoo on Maria's arm. Such a small symbol, barely larger than a coin, yet it represented 40 years of hidden fear and the potential destruction of everything Maria had built in America. Her phone rang, interrupting her research. It was Detective Rodriguez from the local police department, someone Sarah had worked with on previous immigration cases involving criminal issues. Sarah, I'm calling because I heard through the grapevine that you're representing Maria Santos in the deportation case that's been in the news. Yes, that's correct, Sarah replied cautiously, wondering why a detective would be calling about an immigration matter. I thought you should know that Carlos Vega, the guy who's making accusations against your client, has quite a history with our department. He's been involved in several fraud schemes over the years, mostly targeting elderly immigrants. Nothing we can make stick in court, but he's definitely not a reliable witness. Sarah felt a surge of hope. What kind of fraud schemes? He's been known to approach immigrants who are facing legal troubles and offer to help them for large sums of money. Sometimes he claims to have connections with immigration officials. Other times he says he has information that could hurt their cases unless they pay him to keep quiet. Are you saying he might be extorting Maria? I can't prove it, but the timing is suspicious. Maria's case has been getting media attention, which means there might be money involved from advocacy groups or donors. Vega might see an opportunity. After hanging up, Sarah immediately called Maria to arrange another meeting. When Maria arrived at the office that afternoon, she looked exhausted and frightened. Sarah noticed that she was wearing long sleeves again, despite the warm weather. Maria, I need to ask you about Carlos Vega. Have you had any recent contact with him? Maria's face went pale. Why do you ask? I have reason to believe he might not be telling the truth about his motivations for coming forward. Has he tried to contact you? Maria was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He called me 3 days ago. I had not heard from him since we left El Salvador. What did he say? He said he knew about my situation, about the deportation case. He said he had information that could help me or hurt me, depending on what I chose to do. Sarah felt her anger rising. Did he ask for money? He said that for $50,000, he would disappear and never speak to the immigration authorities. But if I could not pay, he would have no choice but to tell them what he knew about my past. Maria, why didn't you tell me this immediately? Tears began to form in Maria's eyes. I was ashamed, and I was afraid. Even if Carlos is lying about some things, what he knows about me is true. I did help the resistance. I do have a tattoo. How can we prove that his motivations are bad if the facts he's presenting are correct? Sarah realized that Maria had identified the central problem with their case. Even if they could prove that Carlos was attempting extortion, it wouldn't change the underlying facts about Maria's past involvement with the resistance movement. Maria, I need to understand more about what happened in El Salvador. You said you helped carry supplies to resistance fighters, but I need to know exactly what kind of supplies and what kind of fighters. Over the next 2 hours, Maria told Sarah her complete story. She had grown up in a small village outside San Salvador during the height of the Civil War. Her father was a farmer, her mother a seamstress, and they had tried to stay out of the political conflict that was tearing the country apart. When government forces killed Maria's brother, the local priest had approached her family. Father Miguel was secretly helping coordinate aid to civilians who had been displaced by the fighting, including some who had joined the resistance to protect their communities. The priest told us that Christian duty required us to help those who were suffering, Maria explained. He said that Jesus himself would have fed the hungry and cared for the wounded, regardless of their politics. Maria's role had been to carry baskets of food, medicine, and clothes to hidden camps in the mountains where displaced families were living. Some of these families included men who fought with the resistance, but many were simply civilians trying to survive. The supplies I carried were mostly for women and children, Maria said. Sometimes there were messages, but I never read them. Father Miguel said it was safer if I didn't know what they contained. Sarah took careful notes, looking for legal angles that might help Maria's case. How long did you do this work? About 18 months, from when I was 19 until I was 21. Then, the fighting in our area became too dangerous, and Father Miguel arranged for several young people, including me, to leave the country. Who arranged your travel to the United States? There's an organization, I think connected to the Catholic Church, that helped refugees. They provided false documents and transportation. I never knew all the details. Sarah realized that this information might actually help Maria's case. If she could prove that Maria had been officially recognized as a refugee by a religious organization, it might provide a legal basis for arguing that her resistance activities were justifiable humanitarian work rather than terrorism. Maria, do you remember the name of the organization that helped you leave El Salvador? I think it was called something like Sanctuary Movement, but I'm not sure. Everything was very secretive. Sarah's heart jumped. The Sanctuary Movement had been a well-documented network of American religious groups that had helped Central American refugees during the 1980s. Many of their activities had been controversial at the time, but were now viewed more sympathetically by historians and legal scholars. What happened to the tattoo you received? Who gave it to you, and why? Maria looked down at her arm, even though the tattoo was hidden beneath her sleeve. Father Miguel arranged for several of us to receive the mark. He said it was important for us to remember our commitment to helping others, even after we left El Salvador. But he also warned us to keep it hidden once we reached safety. So, the tattoo was given to you by a priest? Yes, Father Miguel. He said it was a symbol of Christian service, not political rebellion. The bird represents the Holy Spirit, and the circle represents the eternal love of God for all people. Sarah felt a surge of excitement. If she could prove that the tattoo had religious rather than political significance, it might completely change how the immigration court viewed Maria's case. Maria, do you know what happened to Father Miguel? Is he still alive? I don't know. I lost contact with everyone from that time when I came to America. It was too dangerous to maintain connections. Sarah spent the rest of the day researching the Sanctuary Movement and its activities in El Salvador during the 1980s. What she found gave her hope. The movement had been officially investigated by the U.S. government, and many of its activities have been documented in congressional hearings and court cases. She discovered that Father Miguel Ramirez had indeed been a real person, a Salvadoran priest who had worked with American religious groups to help refugees. He had been killed by government forces in 1987, but not before testifying to international human rights organizations about the humanitarian work being done in El Salvador. Sarah also found documentation showing that the bird symbol Maria had described was indeed used by Catholic relief organizations working in Central America during the 1980s. It appeared on official documents and was recognized by international aid agencies as a symbol of humanitarian service. As Sarah prepared to leave the office that evening, she felt more optimistic about Maria's case than she had since learning about Carlos Vega's accusations. She had a strategy now: prove that Maria's activities had been humanitarian rather than political, and that Carlos's testimony was motivated by extortion rather than justice. But Sarah also knew that she would need more than legal arguments to win this case. She would need to find witnesses who could testify about Maria's character and the true nature of her activities in El Salvador. Most importantly, she would need to find a way to discredit Carlos Vega's credibility without appearing to ignore the legitimate concerns that immigration authorities had about admitting people with connections to violent organizations. The next morning, Sarah received an unexpected phone call that would change everything about her approach to the case. The caller was Dr. Elena Vasquez, a professor of Latin American studies at the local university. "Ms. Martinez, I read about your client's case in the newspaper, and I think I might have information that could help her." "What kind of information?" "I've been researching the role of religious organizations in the Salvadoran Civil War for the past 15 years. I have extensive documentation about Father Miguel Ramirez and the network of people who worked with him. If your client was really part of that group, I can provide evidence that their activities were humanitarian, not terrorist." Sarah felt her heart racing. "Would you be willing to testify as an expert witness?" "Absolutely. And, Ms. Martinez, there's something else you should know. I've encountered Carlos Vega before in my research. He was involved with some of the more violent factions of the resistance, not the humanitarian groups. If he's claiming to have knowledge about your client's activities, he might be projecting his own more extreme involvement onto her." As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that Maria's case was about to become much more complex, but also much more winnable. The challenge would be presenting the truth about Maria's past in a way that honored both her courage and her compassion, while exposing Carlos Vega's attempts to exploit her vulnerability for his own gain. The tattoo on Maria's arm, which had seemed like a death sentence for her case just days earlier, might actually become the key to her salvation. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood outside the federal immigration courthouse, watching Maria approach with slow, deliberate steps. Today was the day of the hearing that would determine whether Maria Santos would be allowed to remain in the country she had called home for 40 years, or be deported back to El Salvador. Dr. Elena Vasquez had worked tirelessly to help Sarah prepare for this moment. Together, they had assembled a comprehensive file of documents proving that Father Miguel Ramirez's network had been primarily humanitarian in nature. They had testimonies from other refugees who had been helped by the same organization, photographs of relief supplies being distributed to civilian populations, and even a letter from the Archbishop of San Salvador describing Father Miguel's work as a ministry of mercy in times of darkness. Sarah had also spent considerable time preparing Maria for what was going to be the most difficult moment of the hearing, revealing her tattoo in open court. They had practiced the testimony dozens of times, but Sarah could see the fear in Maria's eyes as they walked into the courthouse. The courtroom was more crowded than Sarah had expected. Word of the case had spread through the local immigrant community, and many of Maria's neighbors and customers from her grocery store had come to show their support. Sarah also noticed several reporters in the gallery, which made her nervous about the pressure this would put on Judge Harrison. Carlos Vega was already seated at the government's table with the immigration attorney. Sarah studied his face as they entered, noting the expensive suit and confident demeanor that seemed inconsistent with someone whose primary motivation was seeking justice for historical wrongs. Judge Harrison called the court to session and asked the government attorney to present his case first. The attorney, a serious young man named James Chun, stood up and addressed the court in a professional but accusatory tone. "Your Honor, the government's case is straightforward. The respondent, Maria Santos, has concealed her involvement with a terrorist organization during her application for asylum and throughout her 40 years of residence in this country. We have documentary evidence and witness testimony proving that she was an active participant in violent resistance activities in El Salvador during the Civil War of the 1980s. Chin then called Carlos Vega to testify. Vega approached the witness stand with confidence, taking the oath and settling into the chair with the ease of someone comfortable with legal proceedings. Mr. Vega, please tell the court how you knew the respondent in El Salvador. I knew Maria Santos when we were both young people living in the same region during the Civil War. Vega began, speaking in accented but clear English. We were both involved with groups that opposed the government forces. What kind of involvement did Ms. Santos have? She carried weapons and explosives to fighters in the mountains. She also helped plan attacks on government installations. I have personal knowledge of at least 3 bombing operations that she participated in. Sarah felt Maria tense beside her. These allegations went far beyond anything Maria had admitted to, and Sarah could see the shock on her client's face. Mr. Vega, do you have any physical evidence of Ms. Santos's involvement with these activities? Yes, I do. Vega reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is a copy of a document from our resistance cell that lists the names of active participants. Maria Santos's name appears on this list, along with details about her specific assignments. Chun approached the witness stand and took the document, then handed copies to Sarah and Judge Harrison. Sarah scanned the paper quickly, her heart sinking as she saw Maria's name clearly typed on what appeared to be an official organizational document. Your Honor, I would like to introduce this document as Government Exhibit A, Chin said. Judge Harrison examined the document carefully. Mr. Vega, can you authenticate this document? How do you know it's genuine? I was the person responsible for maintaining records for our cell, Vega replied. I typed this document myself in 1984. Sarah looked at Maria, who was staring at the document with a confused expression. Something about Maria's reaction told Sarah that there was more to this story than Vega was revealing. When it came time for cross-examination, Sarah approached the witness stand with a carefully planned strategy. She had learned from Detective Rodriguez and Dr. Vasquez that the best way to handle Carlos Vega was to let his own contradictions expose him. Mr. Vega, you testified that you typed this document yourself in 1984? That's correct. In 1984, you would have been how old? 19 years old. And at 19 years old, you were trusted with maintaining official records for a resistance organization? Yes, I was very mature for my age and had some education. Sarah walked back to her table and picked up a file that Dr. Vasquez had helped her prepare. Mr. Vega, I'm going to show you some documents that Dr. Elena Vasquez obtained from the archives at the University of Central America in San Salvador. These are actual records from resistance organizations during the 1980s. Sarah approached the witness stand with a stack of photocopied documents. Can you identify any of these organizations as the group you and Ms. Santos worked with? Vega looked through the documents, his confidence beginning to waver. These are not from my group. There are many different resistance organizations. Mr. Vega, according to these historical records, the area where you and Ms. Santos lived was controlled by the FMLN, a well-documented organization. Are you claiming that you were part of the FMLN? Not exactly. We were affiliated with them. But you testified that you maintained official records. Wouldn't the FMLN have maintained their own records? Vega shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The situation was very complicated. There were many smaller groups. Sarah could see that Vega was becoming defensive, which was exactly what she had hoped for. Mr. Vega, when did you last see Ms. Santos before contacting the immigration authorities about this case? I hadn't seen her since we left El Salvador. So you had no contact with her for 40 years, and then suddenly decided to come forward with these allegations? I read about her case in the newspaper and felt it was my duty to tell the truth. Mr. Vega, have you ever been arrested for fraud? Chun immediately objected, but Judge Harrison allowed the question. Vega's face flushed red as he answered, I have never been convicted of anything. That's not what I asked, Mr. Vega. Have you ever been arrested for fraud? There were some misunderstandings with the police, but charges were never filed. Sarah could see that she was making progress in undermining Vega's credibility, but she knew that the real test would come when Maria took the stand. When Sarah called Maria as her first witness, the elderly woman walked slowly to the witness stand, her left arm carefully covered by the long sleeve of her conservative dress. Sarah had coached her to speak clearly and directly, and to tell her story with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her life in America. Mrs. Santos, please tell the court about your activities in El Salvador during the Civil War. Maria took a deep breath and began to speak in her accented English, her voice soft but steady. Your Honor, I was a young woman caught in a terrible war. My brother was killed by government soldiers, and my community was suffering greatly. When Father Miguel asked me to help carry food and medicine to people hiding in the mountains, I said yes because I believed it was the Christian thing to do. Did you ever carry weapons or explosives? Never, Your Honor. I carried food, medicine, and clothes. Sometimes I carried messages, but Father Miguel told me not to read them because it would be safer if I didn't know what they said. Mrs. Santos, do you recognize the document that Mr. Vega presented as evidence? Maria looked at the paper that Sean handed to her, studying it carefully. Your Honor, this document has my name on it, but I have never seen it before. The activities it describes are not things I ever did. Sarah could see Judge Harrison leaning forward with interest. Mrs. Santos, is there any physical evidence of your involvement with the resistance activities in El Salvador? Maria looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. This was the moment they had prepared for extensively. Your Honor, there's one thing, Maria said quietly. She began to roll up her left sleeve, her hands trembling slightly. I received this mark as a sign of my commitment to helping others. The courtroom fell completely silent as Maria revealed the small tattoo on her forearm. Sarah could hear people in the gallery shifting in their seats to get a better look at the symbol that had remained hidden for 4 decades. Judge Harrison leaned forward to examine the tattoo more closely. Mrs. Santos, can you explain what this symbol means? It is a bird flying in a circle, Your Honor. Father Miguel told us it represented the Holy Spirit bringing God's love to all people. He said we should never forget our duty to help those who are suffering. Sarah then called Dr. Elena Vasquez to the stand as an expert witness. Dr. Vasquez testified about her research into religious humanitarian organizations during the Salvadoran Civil War, presenting evidence that the bird symbol was indeed used by Catholic relief groups. Dr. Vasquez, in your expert opinion, what does the tattoo on Mrs. Santos's arm indicate about her activities in El Salvador? Based on my research, this symbol was used specifically by Father Miguel Ramirez's humanitarian network. People who received this mark were volunteers who helped distribute aid to civilian refugees, not combatants in military operations. Dr. Vasquez also testified about Carlos Vega's background, revealing that her research had uncovered evidence of his involvement with more militant factions of the resistance. Dr. Vasquez, based on your research, is it possible that Mr. Vega's knowledge of Mrs. Santos comes from direct collaboration with her? It's possible, but unlikely. My research indicates that the humanitarian volunteers like Mrs. Santos operated separately from the military units that Mr. Vega was associated with. It's more probable that he learned about her activities through rumors or secondhand information. When Sarah finished presenting her case, she felt confident that they had successfully reframed Maria's story. Instead of a terrorist hiding her past, Maria appeared to be a woman of faith who had risked her safety to help suffering people and had spent 40 years continuing that same mission in America. During closing arguments, she maintained that Maria's involvement with any resistance organization, regardless of its humanitarian claims, made her ineligible for legal status. But Sarah could see that Judge Harrison was not entirely convinced by the government's case. Your Honor, Mrs. Santos has never hidden who she is, Sarah argued in her closing statement. She is a woman who has spent her entire adult life helping others, first in El Salvador and then in this country. The tattoo on her arm is not a mark of terrorism. It is a badge of courage and compassion. For 40 years, she has continued the same work that Father Miguel taught her, feeding the hungry, helping the lost, and strengthening her community. Sarah gestured toward the gallery, where dozens of people from Maria's neighborhood sat quietly waiting for the judge's decision. These people know who Maria Santos really is. She has translated documents for immigrants who can't read English, helped families navigate the healthcare system, and provided groceries on credit to people who were struggling financially. This is not the behavior of someone who harbors violent intentions. Judge Harrison recessed for 2 hours to consider his decision. When court reconvened, the gallery was even more crowded than before. Word had spread through social media about the dramatic moment when Maria had revealed her tattoo, and supporters had gathered to hear the verdict. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, Judge Harrison began, "This court finds that the government has not met its burden of proof in establishing that Mrs. Santos poses a security risk to the United States." Sarah felt her knees nearly give out with relief, but the judge wasn't finished. While Mrs. Santos clearly participated in activities that could be characterized as supporting a resistance organization, the evidence indicates that her role was humanitarian in nature and motivated by religious conviction rather than political ideology. The court also notes concerns about the credibility of the government's primary witness and the suspicious timing of his allegations. Judge Harrison looked directly at Maria as he continued, "Mrs. Santos, this court recognizes that you have built a life in this country based on the same principles of service to others that motivated your actions as a young woman in El Salvador. Your deportation would not serve the interests of justice or the security of the United States." The courtroom erupted in applause and tears as Judge Harrison officially dismissed the deportation proceedings. Maria collapsed into Sarah's arms, sobbing with relief after decades of carrying the weight of her secret. As they left the courthouse that day, Maria walked with her sleeve rolled up for the first time in 40 years. The small tattoo on her arm, which had once been a source of fear and shame, had become a symbol of vindication and truth. 6 months later, Sarah received an invitation to Maria's citizenship ceremony. When Maria took the oath of allegiance to the United States, she wore a sleeveless dress that proudly displayed the tattoo that had nearly destroyed her case, but ultimately saved it. In her speech at the ceremony, Maria spoke about the meaning of courage. Sometimes courage means hiding who you are to protect the people you love. But sometimes courage means showing who you are, even when you're afraid. Today, I am no longer afraid to show that I am someone who believes in helping others, no matter what the cost. The symbol that had brought silence over the courtroom that day had finally found its voice, and that voice spoke of redemption, truth, and the enduring power of compassion to overcome fear.